Hello, everyone. Welcome to this special episode of In Conversation With. I'm your host, Noreen, and today we are in conversation with Philip. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much for asking me, Noreen. It's a great pleasure to be with you.
But before we get started, Philip, I'd love for you to introduce yourself to our listeners.
With great pleasure. So I'm Anglo-French, and I started my career as an investment banker, doing corporate advisory work. And about 35 years ago, I'd been working on M&A in Switzerland, and was invited by a local law firm. One of my employers were invited by a local law firm to act on the sale of Movenpick, which at the time was a publicly listed company in Zurich, which was active in the hospitality, restaurant, ice cream, and wine sectors. That was my first transaction in the hotel sector. And then one thing led to another. And over a period of time, I focused more and more on real estate generally and hospitality within that in particular, so operational real estate, you might say. And latterly, I was head of hotels for EMEA at JLL. That was my last full-time employment. And more recently, I've been working with private equity firms and venture capital on a part-time, non-executive, independent consultancy basis.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that introduction. So you said it was this transaction that kind of led you into the hotel sector, but what was it that made you, I guess, stay in it afterwards?
I think a combination of circumstance and growing interest for the sector. So when I started in corporate advisory, it was quite rare for people to specialize by sector. And this began to happen around the time that I stumbled into the transaction. So at the time I had a choice between things like the food sector, the media sector, and possibly healthcare. And it soon struck me as more and more deals came my way in the hotel sector that it was one I enjoyed very much. Partly because, like everybody else, I'd stayed in hotels, so I thought wrongly that I knew something about the sector, that it'd be easier to understand than something like, say, pharmaceuticals. And also because, compared with other segments of real estate, it quickly became clear that it was much more fun to go and visit hotels in Portofino, Ibiza, than to visit warehouses in Lincolnshire in the morning. So, by the process of elimination, I came to the conclusion that hotels were, for me, also, unlike other areas of real estate, it's a global market. So if you go to a conference in Singapore or in Toronto or New York or pretty much wherever you care to mention, you will meet people you know from the sector. Whereas if you think of, say, office or residential, it's very local. So I also found that aspect of hospitality much more interesting.
I hadn't considered that the different classes of real estate have that sort of local versus very international.
Yeah, for JLL, for instance, for office, we had a West End team and a City team.
That local.
And that is pretty much the norm within those large firms. Whereas the hotel group, we looked after 3 continents just out of one office. So the contrast is striking.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, I think that's the thing that really brings people together, that either the ability to travel and have access to so many different countries and cultures around the world that really draws and attracts people into this industry.
Yeah.
All right. So one of the things that I wanted to pick up on is when we last spoke is how do we get more women to speak up, and whether it's in a meeting room, whether it's at a conference, whether it's, at a boardroom table, what are the things that you've noticed or the things that you've also done to help the female voices to be heard?
So I think, first of all, stating the obvious, it's important to invite women to meetings, conferences, etc., and accept the fact that typically, it's not always the case, but typically men love to talk and they tend to hog the microphone, as it were. And you have to make sure, and I would say this, in fact, of any person that was more likely to be quiet in the room, you must make sure, if you want to get the most out of the conference, the meeting, whatever the gathering is, that those who do not effectively demand the attention all the time are also heard. And often there's a correlation. The person that talks the most has the least interesting things to say, and those that are quieter are thinking very quietly, this is a load of tosh. The reality is something completely different. And it's quite good to let the first wave pass and then say, what do you think, to the person who hasn't said anything so far. Often it will be a woman, and often what she has to say is much more articulate and thought out. If one is in a situation where it's obvious that there is a power balance issue within the organization, you have to defuse that so as to make sure you're talking about something, then it's probably a good idea to prepare beforehand and to say to the person, we're going to talk about this. I know you know a lot about it. I would very much like your contribution at some point. If you don't put your hand up, like in a classroom, I will ask you to speak out. So as to put them at their ease so they can prepare and think about what they want to say. It's pretty basic common sense, but I think it works.
Thank you so much for sharing it. Over the last couple of years, I've been doing so much reading and research on these topics of, why either women are not being invited to speak up or just not speaking up at all. So it was really interesting when we first spoke that you had this experience as well. So I wanted to have that real life examples from yourself that, what is happening in that meeting room or in that conference room and what can we do to prepare. So I think what you just shared, if you're going to ask them a question, make sure they're included, or absolutely. I think those who are not speaking are really taking that time to think and think, to really think of and not a really good response, but at least sometimes either a response or a question that will help us take the conversation in a different direction or help us to think about something in a different way. But I think the one thing I did want to ask as a follow-up is I liked how you said demand the attention. So if we were to demand the attention for ourselves, again, this is probably regardless of gender, how do we do that effectively?
Well, obviously every audience is different, but for me, the most important thing if I'm listening to someone is whether I think that what they're saying on the subject that they're talking about is cogent, is evidence-based, and is actually going to advance our thinking. Because the purpose of the conversation is to come to a resolution or share some understanding. It's not usually in a business context held in a vacuum. There's always an aim. So I will obviously, and that's part of the preparation for the meeting, is that sometimes the private conversation is saying, we're going to talk about this. I know you're an expert on this subject, but for a variety of reasons, we're doing it in a wider group where there are people who are not as knowledgeable as you are, who will nonetheless not feel constrained about expressing their views, and will regard this as an opportunity for peacocking or whatever. I still want to hear something constructive on the subject, and I think it'd be good for the rest of the group to hear it. So please, do share what it is that you've said to me or that I know you know, or whatever, depending on it.
Yeah. I'm a big advocate for visibility. I used to be the quiet one in the room, never speaking up, never raising my voice. But I realized very quickly that if I don't, my career is not going to progress. So sometimes it felt like a physical effort, but yes, I either had to put my hand up or I just had to speak out. And it was like a physical effort, but
Yes.
I'm so glad I did it because if I
Yes.
didn't, I would not get noticed. I would never be heard and no one would even pay attention to me. So how am I supposed to get, that next opportunity, the next, it doesn't always have to be like a promotion, but sometimes it's a new project to work on or another, business opportunity to pursue that you can then be leading or driving it forward. But if you're not creating that visibility for yourself, you're definitely not going to be able to move forward. And also, I also say there's an opportunity cost to not speaking up, right? Because you not only owe it to yourself, but you also owe it to your organization to be the one there sharing your thoughts. Because as we just said, you never know where that will lead and what resolution will come out. It may be a better one than what was being previously discussed.
The more you put your hand up, the easier it becomes. That's the first thing. The second thing is it's a bit like voting. If you don't if you don't participate in the discussion, in the debate, then you can't complain if afterwards a decision is taken that you don't agree with or think for some reason mistaken. And finally, the last thing you want, because it really gnaws away at you, is to leave the room and say, "Oh, I wish I'd said that," or "If only I'd said that." "Oh, they got it all wrong. The truth is this, that, and the other," because that doesn't do anybody any good, least of all yourself.
So staying on the topic on speaking up and making sure that you're not leaving that meeting saying, "Oh, I wish I'd said that," or perhaps, something you could have offered something to the group that would give a different level to that conversation. What I also come across a lot, or why we advocate for diversity, is to avoid the groupthink so that we're not having that sort of homogeneous environment. We're all thinking the same way. I mean, the beauty of it is that, as individuals, we're all different and we've all had different backgrounds and experiences and upbringings, from various different parts of the world. So how do we bring that together to ensure that as a team, as an organization, we're making better decisions?
I totally agree with your premise. I, again, thinking back to the early years of my career, there was very little diversity in the group which I worked in. And there was, in fact, quite obvious looking back segregation. It was class-based, it was gender-based, ethnicity-based, nationality-based. So there are a lot of factors that I wasn't really that aware of at the time, but I recognize now in retrospect, meant that the group that I joined was very much tailored to a particular model. And what it meant was exactly what you said, that inevitably you end up in a situation where people are more likely to think alike, and therefore more likely, like lemmings, to jump off the cliff altogether rather than have someone say, "Hang on a minute, is this really the right direction to be running in?" Clearly, if you're organizing a group for whatever purpose, you want to avoid that. And therefore, the first step is to make sure that the group that you put together is diverse in every sense, obviously with people who are saying to contribute to whatever effort you're working on, but regardless of all the other factors I just mentioned. And then back to your first point, you have to make sure that all these different parties with their different perspectives speak up so that you can actually be in a situation where you benefit from these different perspectives. Otherwise, you end up in a situation where everyone is mimicking the boss, and then the boss doesn't get anything out of the group. And all that happens is that you have a sort of echo chamber of people all saying the same thing, which is what the boss already knows he thinks. So it's a complete waste of time for all concerned.
So if you're the boss, how do you not create that echo chamber? Because I'm just thinking like hypothetical scenario, you come in, you're the boss, you're coming in and you're sharing, your project, your vision, whatever it may be. And if everyone is just going to be agreeing with you, you're right, you're not benefiting from that, the diversity in the room. How do you create that environment that they're not going to just, yeah, echo back to you what you already know?
So if you brought people together in order to communicate what you've already decided to do, sometimes you have to do that. And the purists would say, well, if you've already decided you're announcing something, you make an announcement by email or whatever, you don't need a meeting. In truth, of course, we know that often you do, but then it's not really a meeting. It's like a speech or maybe questions at the end, but they're usually pretty formal and designed to flatter the speaker. So they're not very productive from the point of view of a genuine exchange of views. And if, on the other hand, you're coming into a meeting where the decision has not been taken, and you're genuinely canvassing opinion, then it probably makes sense for you to set in advance the parameters of the discussion, explain how long we have, what the options are, let people think about them, and explain that you expect them to express their views, and sum up at the end. But don't start off by saying, "This is what I think we should do. Challenge me if you think otherwise," because then you're making it difficult for people to be honest about what they think.
I think what I'm taking away from this exchange is like that being prepared, before any interaction. I think you could save so much time. I think people just default or trying to save time. I mean, I've experienced this myself. You just throw a meeting together with a bunch of people. But if you can spend a little bit of time ahead of time being thoughtful about what do you need this meeting for, get everyone on the same page of what that is, and then, you can have a far more productive interaction. And I think you're absolutely right. There's also you need different formats for different times, right? Sometimes it is just a speech, it's more inspirational. It's, vision sharing and you're not really expecting any feedback. But if what you're looking for is feedback and challenge, set that up at the outset so that people can come prepared. And I think that goes across the board for any culture as well, because, I interact with multiple cultures around the world. I think sometimes the workaround for this scenario is allow them to be prepared in advance so that they can come with ideas and things that they may want to suggest within that discussion.
Yes, and there's a third format which I've seen used by other people, which I think can work if it's done, as Americans would say, candidly. It goes back to our earlier conversation about working lunches, is if you make a habit, maybe once a week or whenever your schedule allows, of meeting a number of people in the organization, in the canteen or wherever for lunch.
Mm.
And make sure that as you work through the year, you do this with absolutely everybody, because you don't want to create any feeling of discrimination uh, with the chosen few versus anybody else. And you make it very clear that there's no agenda. The purpose of the lunch is just to have lunch together, and you're trying to create an informal setting where people can talk about anything, cricket if they feel like it, but they can also ask you questions about the business, your own experience, whatever. If you want a conversation similar to the one we're having now, where the normal rules don't apply, people can ask you questions without feeling that they're being judged or marked or in any way um, put in a position where they might feel inhibited about asking you a question.
I remember reading a section of a book recently about, when a leader came into a new organization and he wanted to bring about change. What he did was a combination of what we've just talked about. He went to every single office that they had across the country and spent time with the teams asking, like, I think two questions, like, what's going wrong and what can I do to help you?
Yeah,
And he just allowed that space for people to just share whatever they wanted to share and like no repercussions, nothing, like just a safe space. And he did very little talking himself. It was actually him just listening. And
yeah,
then I think, 6 months later, he said, okay, I've collected all the feedback, I've taken on board everything you said. Obviously, you can't change everything, but here are like, I don't know, 3 themes or 5 themes that we're going to be focusing on and, bring it in. But because he had spent all that time up front, everybody was already on board
yeah.
because they felt that they'd been listened to and they'd been heard.
That makes so much sense, because if you're a newcomer to an organization, by definition, however talented you may be, you know much less about the organization than the people already there. So you want to start by listening. If you have the luxury of time, obviously it's not always the case, but if you have, then that's what you want to do.
Yeah. So I wanted to move on to the next part of our conversation, which is to ask from your experiences what career advice you would have. And this is for any gender, of course.
Yeah. So it's very interesting you should ask me this question, because I'm going through this conversation with my younger son, who's an undergraduate. So we're talking about what happens next. So I find myself falling back on probably somewhat trite truisms, but I do think that they are valid. Um, the first thing, obviously, once you've worked out what it is that you think you enjoy doing and be good at, um, that 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 you want really to try and deal with is how to pick between two different jobs, or two different organizations, or two different. And looking back, I didn't realize this at the time, but looking back, I really enjoyed roles in which either I was learning something new, uh, effectively adapting to a new role, for instance, or working in a new part of the sector that I had not had exposure to before. And the other factor, the combination is ideal, obviously, is to work for someone ultimately your direct boss or direct bosses, people you trust, people you regard as intelligent, diligent, and ethical. And people have said to me, well, that's easy for you to say because you've come towards the end of your full-time career, you've had a luxury of choice, but when you're starting off in life, it's not that easy, and jobs aren't that easy to come by. You have to make sacrifices. And I said, yes, all that is true. But at the margin, if you have a choice of working for someone who, on first acquaintance, makes you feel comfortable that you trust them, and someone about whom you're hesitant, I would definitely listen to that voice, not ignore it for the sake of the money or the location or the prestige of the firm, because 9 times out of 10 you'll regret having made the choice. Otherwise, the other thing that I would say, which I found very helpful, and even more so as I've progressed in my career, is to pick up on your earlier point. Approach any interaction with the people that you're working with or looking to work with, be they colleagues, be they counterparts in other organizations, be they clients, is start from the premise of trying to work out how you can be helpful. And I think that will immediately put the discussion in the right frame of mind as far as the person on the other side of the table is concerned. And it's much more rewarding for you as an individual in the short term and in the long run. So those will be my essential recommendations. I hope they apply to pretty much any circumstance.
I would thank you so much for sharing that, Philip. And I would definitely agree with what you just shared there about choosing the person that you want to work with. You are going to be spending a lot of time with that individual. Yeah. So you have to feel comfortable. That is 100% true. Yes, perhaps jobs are not easy to come by. There are definitely many cases like that. But yeah, if you have that moment where you've got to make a choice between two, that is definitely sage advice. And on to my final question, which will be, who inspires you?
So my family get bored with my droning on about Jean Monnet, one of the founding fathers of the European Union. What I particularly liked about him, and this really touches on everything we've been talking about, is that he was a problem solver, and he was someone who was very good at making people from different walks of life work together. And he did two things, I think, which are essential in that regard. One was that whenever he was confronted with any kind of problem, those were usually to do with diplomatic negotiations, he would say, we all sit on the same side of the table. The problem is on the other side. We all work together to solve the problem. So instead of our discussions being a zero-sum game between opposing camps, they are a joint effort to solve whatever problem it is for the common good. And the second premise was that any discussion, any negotiation, regardless of circumstance, where people came from, etc., was done on the basis of equality. There was no dominance. If you think of some of the diplomatic negotiations, or negotiation is too strong a word, exchanges that we've seen in recent times where clearly dominance is to the fore, that's the opposite of what Monnet and frankly the European Union stands for, which is that, as you know, small countries and large, regardless of how big or wealthy they are, all have the same rights within the Union. I think is a good way to approach life. So he's my hero.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And actually, that's a really good point to end on about that negotiation, because negotiation comes up a lot in a lot of the conversations that I'm having. And it's so true. We are on the same side. It's not about, what is each person going to get out of it, right? It's not about, me versus them, but it's actually, how can we come together that works for both sides? So I think it's a much refreshing, not refreshing. I think it makes it more approachable.
I agree.
But thank you so much for being in conversation with us today, Philip.
It's been a privilege and a great pleasure. Thank you so much. All the best.